Mulberry Street in Little Italy is a narrow block, the kind of street that holds its history in its doorways, a run of tenements and storefronts where the distance between the neighborhood and the organization that ran it was never more than a few feet of sidewalk. And it was here, in the last cold winter of his life, inside a plain social club at number 247, that one of the most feared men in the American underworld spent his final months doing something that looked, from the outside, like an ordinary act of family devotion. He was protecting his nephew. The nephew had a problem that could not be made to go away. The nephew had been recorded by the federal government in his own home, saying things that could get a dozen men killed, and the boss of the family wanted those recordings handed over so that he could decide which of those men would die for what was on them. The old man stood in the way. For as long as he stood there, no one moved. The old man was the underboss. His name was Aniello Dellacroce, and most of the men who feared him simply called him Mr. Neil. He had spent 50 years learning exactly how this world worked, what held it together, and what tore it apart. And in the autumn of 1985, he was dying of lung cancer while trying to hold together a family that was already pulling itself in two. His protection of his nephew was an act of loyalty and an act of liability at the very same time, and the strange truth at the center of this story is that both of those things were completely true at once. While he lived, the peace held. The factions stayed in their corners. The boss waited, and the killing did not come. Then the old man died, and 2 weeks after he stopped breathing, two bodies fell on a midtown sidewalk 9 days before Christmas, and the entire world he had spent his life defending died on the pavement with them. Drop a comment and let me know what city you are watching from, because I read those and it genuinely makes my day. If stories like this one are what you come here for, take a second to subscribe and stay a while. There is a lot more where this came from. Now, let me take you back to that narrow block in Little Italy, and to an old man who already knew he did not have long. By the middle of the 1980s, Aniello Dellacroce was the second most powerful man in the largest crime family in the United States, and almost no one outside that family would have recognized his face. The Gambino organization in those years was the biggest of the five New York families and the biggest Cosa Nostra operation in the country, an enterprise that by some law enforcement estimates was pulling in on the order of $1 million a day across loan, sharking, gambling, hijacking, extortion, the construction trades, the garment district trucking that moved nearly every dress made in the city, and the cargo theft that bled the freight terminals at the airport. It counted, by some estimates, 500 formally inducted members and many thousands of associates beneath them. A family that size was not one thing. It was two things held in an uneasy balance, and the man who held that balance was Dellacroce. On one side stood the earners, the white-collar wing, the men who thought of themselves as businessmen first and gangsters second, who preferred quiet money to loud violence, and who had inherited the family from its previous boss. On the other side stood the street, the blue-collar crews, the hijackers and the leg breakers, and the old-fashioned soldiers, who believed that the family was supposed to be run by men who had come up the hard way and done the work with their own hands. Dellacroce led the street. He was the underboss to a boss he did not entirely respect, and he commanded the loyalty of the men who actually frightened people, including a rising and ambitious capo named John Gotti, whose crew operated out of a club in Queens and who treated the old man as a second father. The only reason the two halves of the family had not already gone to war was that the street still answered to Dellacroce, and Dellacroce had decided, for reasons rooted in a code older than any of the men involved, that there would be no war. He looked by the 1980s like somebody's grandfather. He was a tall, broad man going gray, often with a cigar working in the corner of his mouth, his voice worn down, his body beginning to fail him. But the men around him never forgot what the surface concealed. A New York organized crime detective named Ralph Salerno, who had spent an entire career studying these men up close, once said that, of all the gangsters he had met, there were only two whose eyes he never wanted turned on him in anger, and Dellacroce was one of the two. He had the eyes of a killer, Salerno said, a cold and frightening stare, and the detective was not speaking in metaphor. As far back as the early 1960s, Federal narcotics hearings had cataloged him in plain language as a man in gambling, loan sharking, extortion, and strong arm work. He had earned those eyes across decades in a part of the underworld that most of the younger men around him had only heard about in stories. The two worlds even occupied two different maps of the same city. Castellano governed from his hilltop on Staten Island, remote and insulated, a boss who summoned men to him and kept his distance from the dirt the money came from. Dellacroce governed from a storefront in the middle of the oldest Italian neighborhood in Manhattan, surrounded at all hours by the soldiers and associates who treated the Ravenite as a second home. The street wing's money came from the work the earners preferred not to think about too closely: the hijacking of freight from the cargo terminals at the airport, the truckloads of stolen goods moved and resold, the policy banks and the sports betting, and the loans made at rates engineered so that a borrower could never quite climb out from under them. Gotti's own crew, working out of a club in Ozone Park, had built itself on exactly that kind of muscle. It was unglamorous, and it was constant, and it was the engine the whole family ran on, and the men who turned that engine took their orders, in the end, from the old man on Mulberry Street. What made him dangerous was never only that he could order a man killed. Plenty of men in that world could order a man killed. What made him dangerous, and what made him truly irreplaceable, was that both sides of a divided family went quiet and listened when he spoke. The earners trusted that he would keep the street in line. The street trusted that he would never let the earners forget where the family had come from and what it had been built on. He was the hinge that the whole structure turned on, the one piece holding two incompatible halves in a single working machine. And by the final months of that year, the hinge was rusting through. To understand how much authority one old man could carry into a sick room, you have to go back roughly 50 years, to a butcher's assistant from Little Italy who learned his trade inside the deadliest enforcement operation the American underworld ever assembled. Aniello Dellacroce was born on the 15th of March, 1914, in New York City, to Francesco and Antoinette Dellacroce, first-generation immigrants from the Campania region of Italy. He grew up in the Little Italy section of Manhattan, in a tenement near the very block where he would one day make his headquarters. His nickname, Neil, was simply the American flattening of Aniello. As a teenager, he worked as a butcher's assistant, and when honest work grew scarce, as it did for so many in those years, he did what a great many young men in that neighborhood did, which was turn to crime, picking up an early arrest before he was old enough to understand what he was committing the rest of his life to. By the late 1930s, he had attached himself to the Mangano crime family, the organization that would one day be renamed for Carlo Gambino. There he became a protege of a man who was rising fast and frightening everyone he passed, the family's underboss, Albert Anastasia. Through Anastasia, Dellacroce was drawn into the operation that gave the era its nightmares. Anastasia was the operational head of what the newspapers came to call Murder Incorporated, the contract-killing arm that carried out executions for the National Crime Syndicate, and Dellacroce came up inside it as a button man, a working killer who learned the craft of administering death from some of the most accomplished practitioners the country has ever produced. The stories that attach to him in those years are the kind that calcify into legend. The most enduring is the account that he once carried out a killing while dressed as a Roman Catholic priest, a disguise that earned him one of his stranger nicknames, Father O'Neill, and reportedly left the police chasing a phantom in a clerical collar. The record does not let us verify every detail of a story like that, and it is fairer to admit as much than to pretend otherwise, but it tells us something true about the reputation, which is that the men around him believed it. His base became the Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street, a storefront that had opened decades earlier under a different name as the Knights of Alto, and had served as a den for the city's most important gangsters since the days of Prohibition. The club itself was a kind of institution. Over the decades, it had drawn figures from across the five families, and under Dellacroce, it became one of the most closely watched and least penetrable addresses in the city, a place where the most important conversations happened in low voices and the most important men came to pay their respects. His own rackets were the classic ones, gambling and loan sharking and extortion, but they reached into ordinary business in the quiet way the family preferred. In one documented arrangement, a plastics company in New York handed him 22,500 shares of stock, worth roughly $112,500, in exchange for what amounted to peace with its own labor force. That was how the money truly moved, not in dramatic robberies, but in the steady, patient pressure a man like Dellacroce could apply to anyone who needed a problem to disappear. Dellacroce ran his affairs out of it and rose to capo, a captain with his own crew. Then came the turning point that defined everything that followed. The old boss of the family, Vincent Mangano, had vanished and was presumed murdered, and Anastasia had taken the top spot. But on the 25th of October, 1957, gunmen walked into a barber shop inside a Manhattan hotel and shot Albert Anastasia to death while he sat draped in the chair, and the man widely suspected of arranging the killing was Carlo Gambino, who took over the family in the aftermath. Dellacroce had been one of Anastasia's strongest loyalists. The family briefly split, with a faction loyal to Anastasia's memory squaring off against Gambino's people, and Dellacroce stood with the old guard during the danger. By every code of personal feeling, he had every reason to keep fighting the man who had killed his mentor. He did not. He was an old-school gangster, and the rule he had absorbed down into the bone was that loyalty to the family and to its sitting boss came before any personal grievance, no matter how raw. Gambino, who was no fool, called him in, assured him he would be spared if he ended the resistance, and Dellacroce agreed. He pledged his loyalty to Gambino in the name of unity, and Gambino rewarded him for it, handing him the Ravenite as his permanent base and a captain's crew. In 1965, Gambino moved aside the aging underboss Joseph Biondo and elevated Dellacroce into the second highest position in the family. Along the way, the law took its smaller bites. In 1971, he was sentenced to a year in state prison for contempt after refusing to answer a grand jury's questions about organized crime, the silence itself a kind of testimony to the code he lived by. That silence before the grand jury was not stubbornness. It was the central law of his world, the rule called omerta, the absolute prohibition against cooperating with the authorities or even admitting that the organization existed at all. Dellacroce had been raised inside a system that treated that silence as sacred, that bound its members with a ceremony and an oath, and that answered the breaking of the code with death. He believed in it the way other men believe in religion. The entire architecture of the family, the secrecy and the discipline and the refusal to speak certain names aloud in the wrong rooms, existed to guard against exactly the kind of exposure that the heroin tapes would one day represent. To a man like Dellacroce, the danger his nephew posed was never only a legal danger. It was a violation of everything the life was supposed to mean, a man talking freely in a world built entirely on not talking. That he would choose to protect that man anyway at the very end says something about how the pull of blood could override even the deepest principle a man held. That was the rule he had honored since 1957, the rule that explains everything about how he would behave nearly 30 years later. Loyalty to the boss above your own feelings. He had kept it when keeping it cost him the chance to avenge the man who taught him the entire business, and it was about to be tested again, in a way that nothing in 5 decades had prepared him for, because the next time the rule was put to him, the boss it would force him to obey was a man he believed had been handed something that should have been his. On the 15th of October, 1976, Carlo Gambino died of natural causes at his home, and the question of who would replace him split the family along the line that had always run beneath it. Gambino did not name Dellacroce, his own underboss, and the obvious heir by seniority and by service. He named his cousin and brother-in-law, Paul Castellano, a man who had built his fortune in the legitimate and semi-legitimate worlds of the meat and poultry business and the garment trade and construction, a man who thought and lived like a corporate executive. Castellano ran his empire from a mansion on the high ground of Staten Island so grand that people compared it to the White House, and his businesses were so much a part of his identity that one of his many nicknames, The chicken man came straight from the poultry distribution he controlled. Gambino seems to have believed the family's future lay in Castellano's kind of quiet, white collar money rather than in the old street rackets, and he wanted his own blood at the top. There was a problem of timing that sealed it shut. Dellacroce was in prison when his boss died. He had been convicted of tax evasion in 1973, sentenced to 5 years and a fine of $15,000, and from inside a cell he was in no position to contest anything at all. The succession was confirmed at a meeting on the 24th of November, with Dellacroce present and silent, the title going to Castellano, while the man with the better claim watched. It was an open wound from the very first day. Many of the family's traditionalists believed that Dellacroce had been robbed, that the underboss, who had spent his life doing the actual work, should have inherited the family rather than the cousin, who had spent his life in offices and counting houses. The two men were a study in opposites, so complete it was almost theatrical. Castellano was aloof and image conscious, a boss who held court at his hilltop mansion, who had once been among the dozens of mobsters swept up at the notorious Appalachian meeting in upstate New York in 1957 and had done a year for refusing to talk about it. A man who preferred to think of himself as a businessman who happened to have power rather than a gangster who happened to have money. Castellano's empire was vast and mostly hidden in plain sight. He controlled a poultry distribution business that supplied a large share of the city. He had his hand in the meat trade and in construction and in the concrete that went into the buildings rising all over New York, and through a relative he held enormous influence over the trucking that moved the garment district's goods. He was so reclusive and so preoccupied with the appearance of legitimacy that some in the underworld called him the Pope. To the earners, all of this was proof that he was exactly the right kind of boss for a modern family, a man who made his money quietly and spilled little blood. To the street, it was proof of precisely the opposite, that the family had been handed to a man who had never really lived the life and who looked down on the men who had. For 9 years, Dellacroce stood between that resentment and the boss, settling disputes, absorbing complaints, talking his own people back from the edge again and again, and the family held together because he willed it to hold. Dellacroce was the street incarnate, a Murder Incorporated alumnus who ran his affairs out of a storefront with an espresso machine and a back room. The earners gravitated to Castellano and his world of contracts and percentages. The soldiers stayed loyal to Dellacroce and the older idea of what the family was for. And the one man who could have lit the fuse simply by giving the word chose, once again, to honor the code. He pledged his loyalty to Castellano. He ordered his crews to do exactly the same, and for nearly a decade he kept the peace by the sheer gravitational force of his own authority. Castellano got the title and the mansion and the deference of the entire underworld, but the men who actually made the neighborhood afraid still looked to the old man in Little Italy, and that arrangement carried a fatal dependency built into its very design. It could last only as long as Dellacroce himself lasted. The peace was not written into any agreement or guaranteed by any structure. It lived inside one aging body, and when that body failed, there would be nothing left at all to enforce it. The man whose recklessness would eventually pull the entire structure down was the old man's own nephew, and he carried in his mouth what the family came to regard as a loaded and unsecured weapon. Angelo Salvatore Ruggiero was born in New York City, with most sources placing his birth on the 29th of July, 1940, though the record is not perfectly consistent and some accounts give the year as 1941. He was the maternal nephew of Aniello Dellacroce, and that single relationship is the hinge on which this whole story turns. He was raised in the East New York section of Brooklyn, where as a boy he fell in with another local kid who would grow up to become the most famous gangster in America, John Gotti. The two were friends for the rest of their lives. They came up together through petty theft and street fights and stolen cars. They were schooled by the same Gambino capo, a man named Carmine Fatico, and they rose side by side inside the family, eventually operating out of Fatico's crew at a club in Ozone Park, Queens. Ruggiero was a stocky man with a voice turned to gravel by years of cigarette smoke, and he had two habits that everyone around him knew, and that together made him a legend of the wrong kind. The first was that he walked with a distinctive rolling waddle. The second, and the dangerous one, was that he could not, under any circumstances, stop talking. He talked about everything, to everyone, constantly, in person and on the telephone, and the combination of the walk and the mouth earned him the nickname that would follow him to the grave, Quack Quack. One associate captured the whole problem in a single grim joke, saying that if you dialed any 7 numbers at random, there was roughly an even chance that Angelo would be the one who picked up. In a world where survival depended on silence, on the iron discipline of never saying anything that could be used against yourself or anyone you knew, Angelo Ruggiero was a man who appeared to be constitutionally incapable of keeping his mouth shut. This was not, for all that, a man without nerve. He had taken part in serious and bloody work. He was involved in the 1973 killing of a man named James McBratney, alongside John Gotti and a third man, a murder carried out at a bar on Staten Island as revenge for the kidnapping and death of a relative of Carlo Gambino. Gotti would serve time for that killing, and the two men's bond was forged in part by the violence they had done together. The McBratney killing was not random violence. It was revenge. A young relative of Carlo Gambino himself had been kidnapped and murdered, and McBratney was believed to be one of the men responsible, and the contract to settle that account fell to Gotti's circle. The killing made Gotti's reputation inside the family as a man who could be trusted with the most serious work, and it deepened his bond with Ruggiero into something the later betrayals never entirely erased. When Gotti came out the other side of the prison time the killing cost him, he rose quickly, taking over the crew he had come up in and turning it into one of the most productive and most feared in the entire family. Ruggiero rose alongside him, always a step behind, always the talker, always the friend, and always, in the background of both their lives, the nephew of the underboss whose protection hung over the two of them like a roof. Ruggiero was also long suspected in the 1980 disappearance of John Favara, the neighbor of Gotti's who had accidentally struck and killed Gotti's 12-year-old son with his car, a man who vanished one day and was never seen again. Sammy Gravano, who would later sit across tables from Ruggiero before turning and testifying against the entire world he came from, summed him up with the brutal economy that marked everything Gravano said as a witness. He had a lot of guts, Gravano said, but not much in the way of brains. He was brave. He was loyal to the point of self-destruction, and he was lethal. And he was at the same time the single most dangerous liability the family possessed, because the one thing he could not do was the one thing that mattered more than anything else. For most of his life, the talking had been only a personal flaw, an embarrassment, the kind of thing that made the careful men around him wince and change the subject. In the autumn of 1981, it stopped being a personal flaw and became a federal opportunity because the United States government found a way to listen to every word. On the 9th of November 1981, the Department of Justice in Washington authorized a wiretap on a home telephone in Queens that its owner was absolutely certain was safe. The phone was in Angelo Ruggiero's house, but it was listed in the name of his daughter, Princess Ruggiero, and Angelo had told the people he trusted that the line was clean, that it was the one phone they could not touch. He was wrong in a way that would echo for the rest of the decade. The FBI's Gambino squad had built the case with the help of informants, and one of those informants did something that turned an ordinary wiretap into a catastrophe. A longtime associate named Wilfred Johnson, known on the street as Willie Boy, a man who had been close to Gotti's crew for years and who was secretly feeding the Bureau the whole time, provided the agents with the interior layout of Ruggiero's home. That diagram let them go far beyond the telephone. It let them plant listening devices inside the house itself, 4 hidden microphones in the rooms where Angelo did his endless talking. The surveillance began as an investigation into loan sharking and illegal gambling, the ordinary rackets that Ruggiero ran with the Gotti brothers. But it did not stay there because Angelo did not stay there. The federal affidavit that justified the wiretap had already painted him in the starkest terms, describing him as a known killer who would seek physical retribution and might well murder a debtor who could not pay. And the bugs soon began capturing something far more dangerous than shylocking. They captured conversations about heroin. There was a specific and tragic reason that heroin had entered Angelo Ruggiero's life at exactly that moment, and the reason was a death. His younger brother was Salvatore Ruggiero, known as Sal the Sphinx, a major heroin trafficker who had spent years operating largely outside the family's official structure and on the run from the authorities. On the 6th of May, 1982, Salvatore was killed when the private jet carrying him went down into the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Georgia. Angelo inherited the pieces of his dead brother's operation, the connections and the product and the cash, and he inherited all of it. At the precise moment when 4 hidden microphones were recording every syllable he spoke inside his own walls. The recordings were devastating, and they were devastating not only to Angelo. They captured him discussing the heroin business in granular detail, and they captured the men he discussed it with, including John Gotti's own brother, Gene Gotti, and an associate named John Carneglia. They even pulled in a lawyer, a man named Michael Coiro, who was recorded being told by the men around the table that he was not merely their attorney, but one of them, and who answered in kind, a moment that would later help destroy careers. When word of the surveillance began to leak through the family, the effect was something close to panic, and the panic ran in both directions. Through the Dellacroce and Gotti faction that stood to be exposed, and through the Castellano loyalists, who grasped what that exposure could eventually mean for all of them. The recordings did not deal in vague suggestion. They captured the business itself being conducted. In one exchange picked up inside the house, the men around Angelo discussed the very heroin that his dead brother had left behind, who had found it and who would hold the money and who could be trusted with the secret, with Gene Gotti directly in the middle of the conversation. Every exchange like that was another nail driven in, and the men driving them were doing it to themselves, in their own voices, in a house they were certain was safe. The tapes turned private crimes into documented federal evidence, spoken in the voices of the criminals themselves, with no informant's credibility to attack and no eyewitness to discredit. On the strength of all of it, in August of 1983, the government indicted Ruggiero, Gene Gotti, and others for conspiracy to distribute heroin. When Angelo eventually realized that agents had been listening to him, he went into hiding for a time, but it was far too late. The words were already recorded, and the words pointed straight at something that the boss of the entire Gambino family had forbidden under penalty of death, which is the fact that turned a narcotics case into a threat against every man whose voice was on those reels. There was one rule in Paul Castellano's family that carried an automatic sentence, and the tapes had caught his men breaking it cold. Castellano had issued a flat prohibition on narcotics, and after Dellacroce's illness became known to the leadership, he hardened it into something even more absolute, ruling that any member of the family who had been formally inducted after the year 1962 was strictly barred from any involvement whatsoever in the drug trade, on pain of death. He went further still, pressing the National Commission that governed the families to adopt a sweeping ban of its own, carrying the same instant penalty. On its surface, this was traditional Mafia public posture, the old and convenient claim that the honored society did not traffic in poison and never had. Underneath the surface, it was something far more calculated. Castellano had begun to suspect that the men gathered around Gotti and Ruggiero were not only dealing heroin in open defiance of the rule, but that Dellacroce himself might be quietly sanctioning the trade and taking a cut of the enormous profits, and the edict was a blade aimed directly at the 3 of them. The rule sat on top of a contradiction that everyone in that world understood completely, and no one ever said out loud. Heroin was forbidden, and heroin was the single most profitable product the underworld had ever touched. The official ban had never actually stopped the trafficking. It had only pushed the trafficking into the shadows and made it deniable. Parts of the family moved enormous quantities of the drug, with the Sicilian wing of the organization plugged directly into refineries and suppliers across the Atlantic, while the same men swore on their honor that they would never touch it. The ban was, in practice, a loaded sentence, waiting for a reason to be used, and the reason it existed was the thing it had always been about, which was control. A boss who could prove that a man had broken the drug rule had earned the right to kill him, and that right was a tool of internal discipline at least as much as it was a matter of stated principle. The penalty also reflected a colder logic. Narcotics cases carried the longest prison terms, and the longest terms were exactly what turned hardened men into cooperating witnesses, so the rule was partly a shield against the very kind of betrayal that would one day bring the whole thing down. The hypocrisy of the rule was not lost on the men bound by it. While soldiers were being told that narcotics meant death, the family as an institution had long been entangled in the heroin trade at its highest and most international levels, with a Sicilian wing connected directly to suppliers across the ocean who refined the drug and shipped it into the country in enormous quantities. The ban, in practice, was less a moral line than a question of who was permitted to profit and who was not, and of insulating the leadership from the long sentences and the flipped witnesses that narcotics cases reliably produced, none of which changed the fact that, on paper and in the family's own law, the men on the tapes had earned a death sentence, and the boss now had the means to prove that they had. The exposure on the tapes was total. Gene Gotti, the brother of one of the most ambitious capos in the family, was caught. Carneglia was caught. Angelo Ruggiero, the nephew of the underboss, was caught worst of all, because he was the one who could never stop talking, and the family had already lived through a smaller dress rehearsal of this exact crisis. An associate of Ruggiero's, named Peter Tambone, had earlier been arrested on a narcotics matter, and the question of what to do with him had climbed all the way up to the commission, the ruling council of the families. Castellano had wanted Tambone killed for breaking the rule, as the rule plainly allowed. The Dellacroce and Gotti wing had resisted, had argued and maneuvered to spare him, and the confrontation had laid bare for everyone just how deep the fault line ran and how little the two halves of the family trusted each other. That earlier fight had been a preview. Now the same dynamic was back, except that the men exposed sat much closer to the center of power, and the evidence against them was not a distant arrest report, but their own recorded voices played back on demand. Castellano did not yet have the tapes in his hands. He knew that they existed, because the federal affidavits and the indictment referred to them in detail. He wanted them, and he knew with perfect precision who was sitting on the only copies that mattered to the family's own private reckoning. What Castellano wanted was simple to state and impossible to grant without bloodshed. He wanted the transcripts of everything the FBI had recorded inside Angelo Ruggiero's house. As the boss, under the family's own internal logic, he had the right to review the evidence of who had broken his most serious rule, and the recordings were the proof, set down in the offender's own words. If he read them, he would hold documented confirmation that Gene Gotti and others had been trafficking heroin in direct defiance of his edict, and under that edict the confirmation meant he could order their deaths. The transcripts were not paper. They were a death warrant in search of a signature, and the only man who could keep them out of the boss's reach was the one man whose voice filled them. Ruggiero refused. He understood with total clarity what surrendering the tapes would mean, and he chose self-preservation and loyalty to his friends over obedience to his boss. To hand them over was to condemn Gene Gotti, to condemn himself, and to hand Castellano a weapon the boss could use to demote or simply erase John Gotti, who was Ruggiero's lifelong friend and his patron in the family. So Angelo, the man who could not control his own mouth in private, became immovable in public on the single subject where silence could save lives. He would not give up the tapes, not to the boss, not to anyone. Castellano pressed and Ruggiero stonewalled, the demand met by a wall, and the standoff hardened into something brittle and dangerous. The boss, blocked, began to consider whether the cleaner answer was simply to break John Gotti's crew apart, to strip away the protection that the whole faction depended on and deal with its members one at a time. For John Gotti, the stakes in all of this were not abstract. If Castellano got the tapes and acted on them, the most likely outcome was not only the deaths of Gene Gotti and the others, but the end of John Gotti's own rise, because a boss who had caught a capo's crew dealing heroin in flat violation of a death penalty edict had every justification he would ever need to break that capo completely. Gotti understood that the demand for the transcripts was, underneath everything, a demand aimed squarely at him. Frank DeCicco, trusted by both sides, spent much of this period trying to keep the peace from collapsing, carrying messages and reassurances back and forth between the factions, and it is one of the quiet ironies of the whole story that the man who worked hardest to hold the two halves of the family together would later become the man who set up the killing that tore them apart for good. And in the middle of it all, standing between the nephew who would not yield and the boss who could not be openly defied, was Aniello Dellacroce. This was the precise position that the entire story had been moving toward from the beginning, the place where the old man's lifelong code collided head on with his own blood. He was the underboss, sworn to loyalty to Castellano, the very same loyalty he had given to Carlo Gambino over the body of his murdered mentor, and he was the uncle of the man at the dead center of the crisis. He did the only thing that his code and his cunning would allow him to do at the same time. He shielded Ruggiero, and he simultaneously counseled Castellano to be patient, to wait and let the court process release the tapes in its own slow time, rather than force a confrontation inside the family that could tear the whole thing to pieces. He used his authority to buy time, to keep the demand from curdling into an order to kill. There was a contradiction buried inside his position that the record does not fully resolve, and it is more honest to name it plainly than to smooth it over. Dellacroce was himself a believer in discipline, and there is testimony that he had warned his own people, including his nephew, that he would kill anyone he caught dealing in narcotics. How a man who said that could also spend the last strength of his life protecting a nephew, caught on tape doing exactly that, is a tension that the surviving accounts simply do not perfectly explain. Perhaps the threat had been posture, and the protection was the thing he truly meant. Perhaps blood outweighed the rule when the moment finally arrived. The men who could answer that question are long dead, and the private conversations in which they would have hammered it out among themselves were never recorded. What the record does establish is the outcome. The Capo Frank de Chico, a respected figure who moved easily between the two factions and who would later prove decisive in everything that followed, did not believe there was any real break between the underboss and the boss. As far as De Chico was concerned, Dellacroce remained a faithful underboss to Paul Castellano right to the end. And that perception was itself part of what held the peace together, because as long as the family believed Dellacroce stood with the boss, the street did not move. What the protection cost the old man is impossible to measure precisely, but it could not have been small. He was a dying man who had spent his entire life proving that he would put the family above himself, and in his final months he was spending the last of his enormous credibility to shield a nephew who had broken the most serious rule the family had. Every day he held the line, he was also holding back the boss he had sworn to obey, balancing two halves of a loyalty that had finally been pulled in opposite directions at once. He had honored the code over his own feelings when Anastasia was killed. Now the code and his feelings pointed toward two different graves, his nephew's, if he let go, and the family's fragile peace if he held on, and he chose, with whatever time he had left, to hold on. For as long as the old man stood between them, the demand went unanswered, the killing did not come, and the peace, brittle as it was, held. But the old man was running out of time, and every man in the family knew it. By the autumn of 1985, the man holding the entire family together was dying, and he was dying of the same disease that would one day take the nephew he was working so hard to keep alive. The cancer was in his lungs, the long bill come due for a lifetime of cigars and cigarettes, and it was not the kind of thing that could be hidden inside an organization where information was the only true currency. The boss knew, the capos knew, Gotti knew, Ruggiero knew, and every man who knew was, whether he ever said it aloud or not, already calculating in private what the family would look like on the morning the old man was finally gone. He was dying under indictment, and that fact pressed down on those final months with its own weight. Dellacroce had been charged as a defendant in the sweeping federal prosecution that the newspapers were calling the Mafia Commission case, the historic effort led by the United States Attorney's Office to convict the assembled leadership of the New York families as the governing board of a single criminal enterprise. It was the most ambitious organized crime prosecution the country had ever mounted, and Dellacroce was scheduled to stand trial the following year alongside the heads of the other families. He would not live to see it. The cancer was moving faster than the courts, and it was the one adversary in his long life that could not be reasoned with, paid off, or outweighted. In an organization like this one, the slow death of a powerful man was never a private grief. It was a countdown that everyone could see. Capos, who had spent years deferring to the old man, began, very quietly, to take the measure of one another. Alliances that had been frozen in place for a decade started very carefully to thaw. Gotti and the men closest to him understood that the protection they had leaned on was about to vanish, and they understood it sooner and more clearly than anyone else because they had the most to lose the moment it did. There was nothing to be done about any of it. No amount of respect or money or muscle could buy the old man another month. All anyone could do was wait and position and prepare, and that is what the family did through the last weeks of 1985, gathering itself for a transition that no one could stop and that everyone sensed would be settled in blood. Through those last months, Angelo Ruggiero was a constant presence at his uncle's bedside. Whatever distance there may have been between the two men in earlier years, and some who knew them said that Dellacroce had always been closer to Gotti than to his own nephew, in the end the nephew was the one who kept showing up, and the old man, even as his body failed him by the day, kept doing the thing he had been doing all along. He kept the family from acting on the tapes. He kept the demand for the transcripts from hardening into a death sentence for Ruggiero and for the others whose voices were on them. His authority, even from a sickbed, even with his strength gone, was still enough to hold the line, because the line had never really been about the strength of his body. It had been about the sheer weight of his name, and the name still carried even as the man behind it slipped away. On the 2nd of December, 1985, Aniello Dellacroce died of lung cancer at Mary Immaculate Hospital in Queens. He was 71 years old. He was buried at St. John's Cemetery in Queens, the ground where so many of the men of his world were laid to rest. And running underneath the simple facts of his death was a single detail of disrespect that would matter enormously in the weeks to come, a detail that landed like a blow across the faces of the men who had revered him. Paul Castellano, the boss to whom Dellacroce had given a full decade of loyalty that he never had to give, did not come to see the old man as he was dying. The boss stayed away from the deathbed of his own underboss, and the meaning of that absence was not lost on anyone in the family. The last meaningful thing that Aniello Dellacroce did with the authority he had spent 50 years accumulating was keep his reckless nephew alive. And the moment he was gone, there was no one left in the entire family with the standing to keep anyone alive, least of all the men whose voices were waiting on the federal tapes. With the old man in the ground, the restraint that had governed the Gambino family for nearly a decade simply ceased to exist. The peace had never lived in any agreement or in any structure. It had lived inside one man, and that man was dead, and the two halves of the family he had held apart by force of will were suddenly free to come at each other with nothing whatsoever in between. Everything that the underboss had absorbed and deflected and patiently delayed for years was loose in the world all at once, in the same instant, and it moved with terrible speed. Castellano made it worse, and he made it worse twice in quick succession. The first injury was the funeral. The boss did not attend the funeral of Aniello Dellacroce. After staying away from the deathbed, he stayed away from the burial of the man who had kept his family unified and his own position secure for 9 straight years, and to the traditionalists who had loved the old man it was an unforgivable insult, a final piece of contempt flung at everything Dellacroce had stood for and at everyone who had followed him. John Gotti, who had revered Dellacroce as a mentor and a second father, was by every account of the men around him enraged by the snub in a way that went well beyond ordinary grief or anger. It confirmed for Gotti the thing he already believed, which was that Castellano held the street in contempt and would never see the men of Dellacroce's world as anything but a problem to be managed and eventually discarded. The second injury was the succession. With the position of underboss now empty, the entire family watched to see whom Castellano would choose to fill it, and the choice was a calculated humiliation. He did not elevate an established and respected capo, as the family's own customs and the dignity of the dead man would have suggested. He reached down and named his own driver and bodyguard, a man named Thomas Bellotti, born on the 23rd of March, 1940, to be the new underboss of the Gambino family. Bellotti was loyal to Castellano and to almost no one else, a blunt instrument with no independent standing among the soldiers, and his promotion told the entire street wing exactly where it now ranked in the new order, which was nowhere at all. Worse still, Castellano was reportedly making plans to break up John Gotti's crew entirely, to dismantle the faction that had gathered around Dellacroce and scatter its men, a move that would have stripped Gotti and Ruggiero of every protection they had left, and almost certainly ended with their deaths over the heroin tapes. The promotion of Bellotti did more than insult the street. It widened the circle of men with a reason to act. Castellano's decision to elevate his own driver over established and respected captains alienated even those who felt no particular loyalty to Gotti, and it left a number of powerful capos quietly calculating that they now had more to lose by staying still than by moving. What began to form against the boss in those weeks was less a single tight conspiracy than a loose coalition of frightened and resentful men, each convinced that inaction had become the more dangerous choice. Frank De Chico, sitting close to Castellano and trusted by him, was the key piece, because De Chico could deliver the one thing a plot like this absolutely required, which was reliable knowledge of where the boss would be and when. With De Chico inside the boss's circle and the street consolidating behind Gotti, the pieces of a plan that would have been unthinkable while Dellacroce lived began, quickly and quietly, to assemble. None of it could have happened a month earlier. The same men had spent years swallowing their grievances precisely because the old man demanded that they swallow them, and the instant that demand was lifted, the grievances became a plan. Gotti did the arithmetic, and every column added up to the same total. He was exposed by the recordings. He had lost the one man who could shield him. His crew was about to be broken apart, and the boss had just publicly disrespected the dead man they all revered. Every road in front of him led to the same place, which was a grave. So Gotti reached the conclusion that the only way to avoid being killed was to kill first, and to kill at the very top, with his closest allies around him, among them Sammy Gravano and the pivotal Frank De Chico, whose position between the factions and whose access to the boss's movements made him invaluable. Gotti decided they would not wait to be summoned and slaughtered. They would assassinate the boss of the Gambino family. The day before it was to happen, a group of the conspirators gathered to go over the plan one final time. They set a date. It was 9 days before Christmas. On the late and bitterly cold afternoon of the 16th of December, 1985, the corner of East 46th Street and 3rd Avenue in Manhattan filled with the ordinary crush of the season, office workers heading home and shoppers laden with packages, and the early dark of midwinter settling over Midtown, and not one of those people had the slightest idea that they were about to stand witness to the most public execution in the history of the American Mafia. The target was a steakhouse called Sparks on 46th Street, where Paul Castellano had a dinner meeting scheduled with several of his top men. The meeting itself was the trap, and the man who had helped to set it was Frank De Chico, whose place on the guest list and whose inside knowledge of the boss's plans handed the conspirators the exact time and the exact place they needed to do the work. The choice of a moment was deliberate, and in its own cold way it was brilliant. Gravano, who helped plan the killing and who much later described the reasoning behind it, understood that the worst imaginable place to commit a murder was also, paradoxically, the safest. 9 days before Christmas, at the very height of the evening rush, in the dead center of Manhattan, surrounded by thousands of hurrying shoppers, no one would be expecting anything. The killing itself would take only a few seconds, and the shooters could melt into the enormous crowd before anyone in it understood what had happened. The confusion of the season would work in their favor. The crush of bodies would work in their favor, and afterward there would be no clean path for any witness to follow. So that was when and where they decided it would happen. The hit team took up its position near the entrance of the restaurant, and the men chosen to do the shooting were dressed in a way calculated to be recognizable to each other and confusing to everyone else, in matching light trench coats and Russian-style fur hats, a uniform that would let them find one another in the chaos and would leave witnesses describing clothing rather than faces. The shooters most often named in the accounts of that evening were Salvatore Scala, Edward Lino, and John Carneglia, the very same Carneglia whose voice had been caught on the heroin tapes, now standing on a midtown sidewalk, waiting to gun down the boss who would have had him killed for what was on them. Down the block, a backup team waited in reserve in case anything went wrong, and among the men in that backup group, by several accounts, was Angelo Ruggiero himself, the nephew whose recorded mouth had set this entire chain of events into motion, present at the very end, weapon ready, never once called into action. John Gotti and Sammy Gravano sat together in a Lincoln, parked near the corner, watching the street, a walkie-talkie between them. Castellano's car came up Third Avenue, and at one point it pulled even with Gotti's Lincoln at a red light, the boss only feet away behind the tinted glass, unable to see the men who were about to kill him. Gravano used the walkie-talkie to alert the team that the target was on his way in. The car carrying Castellano pulled to the curb in front of Sparks in the last gray light of the afternoon, ignoring a no parking sign. Castellano was in the passenger seat, carrying a few $1,000s in cash and nothing with which to defend himself. Thomas Bilotti was behind the wheel. As the two men began to climb out of the car, the shooters in the trench coats closed in from the front of the restaurant and opened fire. Castellano was hit roughly 6 times and was dead almost instantly, his body falling to the sidewalk beside the steakhouse. Bilotti, the brand new underboss, the driver whose promotion had been the final insult to the street, stepped out into the gunfire and was cut down where he stood, shot several times, the accounts most often putting the number at 4. There is some disagreement in the record about the precise count of shots fired into each man and about the exact minute on the clock, with various tellings placing it across the half hour before 6. But on the central fact, every single account agrees completely. Both men died on the pavement within seconds of arriving. In the immediate aftermath, De Chico encountered the boss's own nephew leaving the restaurant and quietly told him to go back to his car and leave, sparing him from the scene. Gotti and Gravano drove slowly past the bodies to confirm with their own eyes that both targets were dead, and then they slipped away into the traffic and the holiday crowds exactly as the plan had called for. It was over in the time it takes to cross a street. The blood ran on the sidewalk beneath the Christmas lights, while the city's sirens were still somewhere off in the distance, and by the time the police and the FBI descended on the corner and lit the scene with portable floodlights so that it looked like the set of a film, the family had a new boss, and his name was John Gotti. The United States Attorney whose office had been building cases against these men condemned the killings and vowed to find the men responsible. But on that night, in that crowd, the new order had already arrived. In the weeks that followed, John Gotti took formal control of the Gambino family, and the consequences that the old man's death had unleashed began to run in every direction at once, including directions that Gotti himself had never intended and could not control. He became, almost overnight, a tabloid spectacle in $1,000 suits who waved to the cameras outside courthouses and beat case after case until the press christened him the Teflon Don, the boss to whom nothing would stick. He had chosen the precise opposite of everything Dellacroce had stood for: visibility over silence, spectacle over discipline, celebrity over the old invisible authority, and for a while it looked to the watching world like a kind of genius. It was not genius. It was a slow and certain form of suicide, and the bill came due piece by piece. The first installment arrived fast and violent. On the 13th of April, 1986, only months after the steakhouse, a car bomb tore apart Frank De Chico, the capo who had helped set up the Castellano hit and who had been rewarded with a high position in the new regime. The bombing was retaliation from within the larger world of the families for the unsanctioned killing of a sitting boss, a brutal reminder that breaking the rules at the very top carried a cost even for the men who had won, and it was a method, the car bomb, that the American tradition had generally avoided. which only underlined how badly the old order had been shaken by what happened at Sparks. The wider reckoning reached far beyond the Gambino family. The Mafia Commission case that Dellacroce had been charged in went forward without him, and in the end the assembled heads of several New York families were convicted and sentenced to terms so long they amounted to the rest of their natural lives, the single most devastating blow the government had ever landed on the leadership of the American Mafia. Castellano, too, had been a defendant in that case, which means that both the boss and the underboss of the Gambino family, charged side by side, died before the verdict ever came in, one of cancer in a hospital bed and one of gunfire on a sidewalk, and the heroin tapes themselves never stopped working. John Gotti was eventually convicted on the very charges the recordings had documented and sent away for 50 years, the price of conversations held in a living room that everyone in them had believed was safe. And the tapes that had started all of it, did not stop working simply because the men they implicated had become powerful. The same recordings and the same kind of relentless surveillance kept producing case after case across the family for years to come. Angelo Ruggiero's heroin prosecution ground slowly forward, and it was a mess from the start, the early proceedings collapsing into mistrials amid allegations of jury tampering, the case dragging on while the evidence of his own recorded voice hung permanently over his head. Even the informant who had made the bugging possible did not escape what he had helped set in motion. Wilfred Johnson, the man whose diagram of the house had let the agents inside, was eventually exposed as a government source, and not long after, he was shot to death near his home, killed for the betrayal that had helped doom the men he had informed on. The recordings he enabled outlived him, as they outlived very nearly everyone they touched. But the deepest punishment did not come from the government at all. It came from his lifelong friend. John Gotti, now the boss, was humiliated and endangered by the tapes that carried Ruggiero's voice, by the reckless talking that had exposed the entire faction in the first place and handed prosecutors a roadmap to all of them, and Gotti turned on him for it. He froze Angelo out completely. He stripped him of his crew and his standing and left him isolated, the man who had been at his side since boyhood, now cast out of the very family he had helped Gotti seize by murder. And then the final irony closed the circle with a kind of awful symmetry. Angelo Ruggiero, the nephew whom Aniello Dellacroce had spent the last strength of his life protecting, was himself diagnosed with lung cancer, the very same disease that had killed his uncle. The cancer spread through his body, and his final years were spent under house arrest and constant surveillance, sick and shrinking and abandoned, cut off from the friends and the family he had refused to betray, awaiting yet another trial he would not live to see. On the 4th of December 1989, almost exactly 4 years after Dellacroce's own death, Angelo Ruggiero died of that cancer at the age of 49, alone in his disgrace. The protection had bought him 4 years and nothing more. He died with no power, no crew, and no friend. The loyalty that had defined his whole life repaid at the end with exile and silence. The rest of the long reckoning followed the same pattern of collapse. In 1991, Sammy Gravano, the underboss who had sat beside Gotti in the Lincoln, watching Castellano die, made the calculation that no one in the old world was ever supposed to make, and became a government witness. In 1992, on the strength of Gravano's testimony, John Gotti was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the Teflon failing him at last when the threat came from inside his own circle. He died behind bars in 2002, having held the family for only a handful of years and having brought down on it the full weight of federal attention that the old discipline had always been designed to avoid. The man whom the old underboss had spent his final months protecting outlived his uncle by less than 4 years and died with nothing. The man who killed his way to the top on the back of that death spent his last decade in a cell and died there too. The visibility that had made John Gotti famous was the exact same visibility that destroyed him, precisely as the old way would have predicted, precisely as Dellacroce had spent his life insisting it would. Aniello Dellacroce was, by almost any honest measure, the last of his kind. the last of the old school underbosses who carried the authority of a vanished era inside one aging body. He had learned his trade in Murder Incorporated, had honored a code of loyalty that cost him a shot at the top not once, but twice, had kept silent before grand juries when silence meant prison, and had spent the final decade of his life holding together a family that wanted with everything in it to fly apart. His authority was the only thing standing between two factions that despised each other, and the strange, sad heart of his story is that the very same loyalty made him both the keeper of the peace and, in his absence, the direct cause of the war, because the peace he kept was never built to outlive him for even a single day. He had poured his entire life into a discipline that depended completely on him being there to enforce it in person, and when he protected his reckless nephew against the boss, in those final months, he was performing the last act of that discipline, holding the line one more time, keeping the killing at bay with nothing but the weight of his name. It worked for exactly as long as he drew breath. The moment he stopped, the line he had held simply vanished, as though it had never been there at all, and everything he had spent 5 decades deferring happened in a single rush of gunfire on a crowded street. His protection of Angelo Ruggiero was the last thing he ever did, and it was at one and the same time an act of love and the single loose thread that once he was no longer there to hold it, unraveled the entire garment. The murder outside Sparks Steakhouse is remembered now as the last great public mob hit, the hinge on which the visible history of organized crime in New York turned. On one side of that hinge lay the old world, the world of silence and discipline and bosses whom no one outside the family could even name, the world that Dellacroce had embodied down to the marrow. On the other side lay the loud and doomed era of John Gotti, the celebrity gangster who burned bright for a few years, and then brought the whole structure crashing down on top of himself in less than a decade. The old man had seen which way the wind was blowing long before the rest of them. He had spent his life insisting on the old discipline precisely because he understood, better than anyone around him, exactly what abandoning it would cost. He simply did not live quite long enough to lose the argument to his own protege's face. He spent his last strength keeping one reckless man alive, and in doing so he kept an entire world standing for a few more weeks than it had any right to stand. When he finally let go, that world fell, and it fell in public, on a midtown sidewalk, beneath the Christmas lights, in front of a city that never even knew his name, which was, in the end, the only thing his protection was ever going to do.